Welcome to the webinar series sponsored by the ASA Statistical Computing section. My name is Zheng. It's my great honor to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Professor Tian Zheng from Columbia University. Professor Tian Zheng is a professor and department chair of statistics at Columbia University, and she has been working on many areas, including statistical machine learning, spatial temporal modeling, and social network analysis. Professor Zheng's research has been recognized by the 2008 Outstanding Statistical Application Award from the ASA, the Mitchell Prize from ISPA, and a Google Research Award. And she became a fellow of ASA in 2014. Professor Zheng is the recipient of the 2017 Columbia Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching. From 2018 to 2020, she was the chair-elect, chair, and past chair for ASA section on statistical learning and data science. Today, Professor Zheng's talk title is Phase-Aligned Spectral Filtering for Decomposing Spatial Temporal Dynamics. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Zheng.
Okay, so I think you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So thank you for the introduction. It is my pleasure to present, as you can see here from my my intro, that I'm an active participant in American Statistical Association, and the section on statistical computing is definitely one section that I've closely followed. And when I was chair for the section on statistical learning and data science, then we were also seeking a collaboration with the statistical computing section. So it was a great honor to be invited to present for this webinar series. So today I want to talk about my ongoing research of try to understand new ways to study spatial temporal dynamics. I'm also wearing a new hat at Columbia, being the co-PI and education director for a new center, new NSF Science Technology Center called Learning the Earth with AI and Physics, which I will say a little bit about at the very end of my presentation on what opportunity I see that this new frontier can bring to the statistical community. And the research I present today is a joint work with my collaborator, Elizabeth Hillman, who is a neuroscientist and biomedical engineer, and my former postdoc, Tian, and my former student, Lu Meng, and it was supported by a grant from Columbia University. So I want to start by saying that in this talk, you will hear about a few applications, because I'm a true believer that in this quote by Turkey, that the best thing about being a statistician is that you get to play in everybody's backyard. And I think given the new era of data science and the need of having more innovations in data science, I think statisticians have a great role to play, not just in the backyard, but in the living room and front yard. So the research started when one of my collaborator was interested in creating dimension reduction for data, as you see on the screen. So what you see on the screen is daily sea level pressure in the central band near the equator, and this data have approximately 4,000 dimensions. However, when you see this dynamic, you will see it is a very high dimensional spatial temporal dynamic, but it is very smooth and seem to have a rhythm to it, which indicate that which motivate my collaborators' interest to reduce the dimension so that they can use reduced dimension, the representative features in subsequent analysis. For that application, they were interested in having a lower dimension representation of such pressure field, capturing its spatial temporal dynamic for a regressional problem to predict weather events down the road. So at that point, the state of art is to use a principal component analysis. And as we will discuss later, that such a method ignore the temporal and spatial dependence of such data and may miss some dynamic that may be useful for analysis down the road. Another motivating application was generated in my collaborators' lab. In their lab, in the lab of my collaborator, Professor Hillman, they developed the technology of using a high-resolution microscope camera to capture neural activities in animals. So here, what you see is that the animal they use neurosurgery to create a transparent window on the skull of mice and then shine laser light on the animal where we're capturing the reflection using high resolution microscope camera. And the mice may be performing tasks in functional in a fashion similar to functional MRI, or could be in a resting state that performing no task, just that. So as you can see here, each pixel is a neuron at a certain level certain layer where the camera focus on. And you can see there are a lot of high dimensional flickering here, which indicating that there are potentially noises and also just individual independent spiking of neuron. But at the same time, you also see some large scale smooth movement of the brain that may have some functional significance that is worth capturing. So this is another application that motivate the methodology development that I will present today. So the dimension reduction, so both application lead to a question of what would be a good way of creating dimension reduction for time series that have a spatial structure. So we're supposed, one way to think about it, suppose we're interested in transmitting our time series and we only have Q channels available here. The Q can be limited by the subsequent learning task, or can be limited by computational resources. And the principal component analysis is usually a popular approach. However, ignored the temporal lags and then also assume independent sampling. So one way I often describe the limitation of PCA to my collaborators is I say, if you're interested in principal component analysis for your data, that means that you can actually shuffle the temporal order of your data without affecting the learned loading matrices. So, and also in a way that it also does not take into account the temporal lag, which means that you don't have to be so concerned about the sampling rates of your observation, because if you believe the underlying system is stationary and there's no information you are trying to capture on the temporal lag, you can take the observation in a much slower without refining your technology of sampling the image faster, which is a big question in both climate modeling and neurosciences, that a lot of technology and computational power and data storage are being used to increase the temporal resolution of data capture. So the underlying assumption of PCA is y equal to a linear loading of some latent unobserved feature z, and then it transformed original variable to uncorrelated principal components. The result, so another limitation of the PC approach is another motivation for our research is that when we try to model the derived principal components, we found that they also have cross correlation, which also makes subsequent autoregression or time series modeling complicated. So now we consider a potential toy example of multiple time series that we created zero mean truncated lag sine function. So here I only show 5 of them, but we actually have more of them. So here we first create functions and we add some noises. And as you can see that this is highly dependent. And here, let's just ignore the spatial part, just consider the temporal part. So a 5-dimensional time series. Then when we do PCA, the PCA is telling us that approximately you should consider the first 2 dimensions, which makes sense because if you think about each of the series is a fixed lag from the previous one, you can decompose this into a combination of 2 series using a simple calculation. So it suggests that we can decompose this 5-dimensional to 2 principal series. Well, when we expand this, and then the 2 principal component series will demonstrate that these 2 series are also structured. They both represent the noise differently, but they also, you can see that they are also dependent. They may be orthogonal in the PCA sense, right? So they have 0 correlation, but in the temporal sense, that they're still very correlated, meaning that the dimension can be further reduced to 1. And then the same thing can be repeated for even higher dimension. So we repeat the same toy example using 64 lagged sine time series with Gaussian noises. And we'll still return to leading principal component series as shown previously. We mentioned that using simple calculation, you rewrite each of the lag into a combination of sine and cosine of the previous series, which corresponding to the 2 principal component series. So this 2 principal component series can explain any of the original series with a fixed lag. So a simple calculation, even when you expand to higher dimensions. And when you plot of the loading of each of the individual series on the original data, you can see there is a very perfect circle, because that's just how the decomposition works. That you can see a perfect circle indicating that there is a fixed phase delay between there is 1-dimensional structure to the 64 time series data, that each of them is a phase delay from a fixed center of series. So this means that if to capture the temporal dependence, there is a 1-dimensional structure here, and also there is a phase delay structure to this. So that create a much easy to explain system than the previous one, where each of series are linear combination of these 2. What this is says that you have a 1 principal series, and then each of the resulting 64 dimensions are lagged behind, creating a if you have the 64 have some spatial distribution, then that can offer a better explanation. So another way to look at this is if we use dimension reduction through PCA, we simulated a more realistic example where the underlying system have two rotating dynamic. One is fast rotating, the other is slow rotating. And these two rotating source are overlaid with each other and with added noises that integrate into this. And when you look at this, you can see this have some resemblance with the first sea level pressure figure that we showed, that you see some smooth movement, but it's not as regular as the these two, and they seem to have movement moving in different directions. We use PCA, we capture some features of the underlying system, but you can see that it does not have the smooth spatial movements that that exhibited in the original source of data, which make it hard for us to study this underlying system in more detail. It will be very hard for us to recover the ground truth system or understand the spatial dynamic in subsequent analysis. Furthermore, this is the first principal component, this second principal component. These are the residuals after we subtracted the first two components. What you can see is that we still have residuals remained in the, you still have spatial dynamics in the residual remain, meaning that the PCA for the first two principal components didn't capture all the dynamic. We may need to get higher dimension, or even so, we will still obtain such component that does not show the same smooth dependence structure in the underlying system. So we like the idea of principal components because they are modeling friendly. They also offer some interoperability, but we think the high dimensional time series deserve to use a different kinds of principal components. So there is such a literature as early as in the 1981 book by Brillinger on time series, data analysis, and theory. One of the chapters is about principal component series. So the theorem addresses exactly this question we want to study. So it assumes that we have an m-dimensional time series that is mean zero and with a underlying spectral density of interest. Then one can create a pair of filters that that allow us to derive an AX and a Z, and which where the Z's that function as and mean squared, which minimize mean squared zero, meaning that we are trying to derive related principal series, and it can be obtained by working with the spectral density function and deriving the eigenvectors of the spectral density function at each frequency. And once you have the eigenvectors, you can derive the corresponding filters using the first k eigenvectors, so it's C and B. And what we get, the result X are referred to as the principal component series, and it had, because of the derivation by using the eigenvectors in the spectral domain, it is not hard to show that the principal component series X has a spectral density matrix, a diagonal spectral density matrix And such a diagonal spectral density matrix offers great modeling benefits that if you want to create subsequent modeling of X for forecast purposes, you don't have to consider cross spectrum. And then the estimation of the spectral density of the principal component series is also quite straightforward, that you will first estimate the spectral density from observed time series to derive the eigenvector and to derive the filters. So using observed data, that you will start with the periodogram, as we usually do, and then but because the raw periodogram can be noisy, so you will subject it to some smoothing and to create a smoothed version of that, and then you can consider the smooth kernel need to satisfy certain regularity requirements. Then when you apply the eigen decomposition in the spectral domain to derive the first R eigenvectors, which will give you the basis to estimate the filter. For the filter, you will replace the integration that in the theorem by summation, because the discreteness of the results based on observed data, then you can just do a inverse discrete Fourier transform to derive the filters. And because of the finite time horizon, you also need to apply some truncation for the computation. So that is what we have in the 1981 book. It was a great and a clear explanation of the theorem. The result is rather elegant. In subsequent analysis of time series book, we do not see a lot of application of the principal component series. There are some very good case studies of using the first principal component series that with the by assemble the filter using the highest eigenvalue from each of frequency. That give you the first principal the principal component series that explain the most one-dimensional principal component that explain the most energy in the spectral domain. In our task, we are trying to understand how we can use the principal component series framework to understand a spectral temporal system of dynamics. So using the toy example I presented, that assuming you have two rotating energy source, and each of this produces signals that is high dimensional but discrete. You also add high dimensional noises that are here we'll assume to have white noises, but the presented framework also work when you have high dimensional red noises. And then the resulting data is the all the three source of values superimposed to each other. And then we're hoping to propose a system which we call it phase-aligned principal component series that give us a recovered system that uncouple the two independent system and then separate it from the noises. So we want to discover low rank principal component series. We will use phase alignments in the frequency domain, a way to incorporate spatial dependence in the series, and then which allow us to discover spatially structured temporal dynamic in the time domain. So we noticed that this was because when we were trying to apply the 1981 main results from Brillinger's book to our analysis, we noticed that the two example, the example used in the book, match the eigenvectors at each frequency by the numerical order. Because the main result in the theorem does not depend on the order of the eigenvectors. So you can derive the first k eigenvectors at each frequency. You can shuffle the k eigenvector at each frequency and assemble different filter accordingly. The results remain the same. So in some of the example we found in subsequent textbooks, two strategies usually apply. One is, as I said, the first principal component using all the highest eigenvalues, which is a great way to summarize the high-dimensional time series into one principal component, or they will assemble the eigenvectors in numerical order. And this seemed to be a great extension of the PCA in the temporal domain, because we usually rank the eigenvalues by their numerical order. In the spectral domain, it does not make sense, because the signals or the principal component series that have high energy in one frequency does not necessarily have the highest energy in another frequency. So there may be other way to assemble them. So in our research, we noticed that we can take advantage of spatial information to identify more meaningful spectrally structured dynamic system, which result to a question. We can do the eigenvalue decomposition at each frequency. Then the next step is, how do we assemble the eigenvectors from different frequency? And this turned into a clustering problem. So recall that we already said that. So recall that I mentioned that that by reassemble the eigenvalues differently does not change the results at all. Then our question is how to capture spatially temporal dependence in a spatially structured way. So the motivation is just sorry, I need to pause. There is so my apologies, there's alarm going off. Sorry. So we decided, using simulation, we discovered that the eigenvalues, or the eigenvectors also have spatial dependence. So we developed a framework that looked like this. So this is the data. We have images, or spatial temporal dynamic can also be thought of as images. We have temporal slices of the dynamic system. And then we first delineate the system into data matrix, ignoring the spatial dependence, and then we will apply the discrete Fourier transform and then the smoothness to derive the spectral density matrices, which each of them is an m by m high-dimensional matrices. Then we apply the singular value decomposition to the R eigenvectors at each f. This gives us a smaller tensor than the previous spectral density matrices. each of the vector here, each of the line here is a eigenvector, and we will put all the we will select the top vectors. We also applied a shrinkage because not all our eigenvectors have very high eigenvalues. And at some frequencies, you may expect to see a very high eigenvalues for all the R eigenvectors. For some other frequencies, you may see a much smaller values at some of the eigenvectors. So we will then project the eigenvectors into the space. One issue we noticed that when we first start analyzing the data, we see a lot of discontinuity in the recovered faces of the eigenvectors. And that was due to the discontinuity in the inverse function when we try to derive the phase. Then this is where the spatial knowledge offered an opportunity to address this computational challenge in this framework. By applying a optimization algorithm called unwrapping from signal processing, we were able to spatially unwrap the faces from these eigenvectors. So once unwrapped, that the eigenvectors imposed in the space of the original data will exhibit spatial structures, and we will then compute the similarity or distance between each of the spatially unwrapped faces. So in a way that we think this is assumption we make that we want to create spatially meaningful principal component series, and we believe that the phase delay captured in the spectral domain offers such opportunity. In a way, we assume that a spatial dynamic is a movement of a signal through space. When you think about movement through space, that suggests phase delays in the signal that one can capture using the spatial dependence. So using the similarity between the spatially unwrapped faces, we calculate the similarity, and then for this prototype of our algorithm, we just applied hierarchical clustering, and other clustering can be applied, and the results are similar. So once you have the phase aligned clustering, then you can assemble the principal component series in the same way as in the 1981 theorem of Bollinger. And then the different clusters lead to different filter, and then you will be able to create filters that separate the two, separate the original data into two series of images in the original temporal domain. So here the spatial are two key innovation is one is in the class. There are opportunities for future directions. One is in the clustering, where we believe there are more ways to derive similarity metrics that are more appropriate for eigenvectors. Also, there are also sparse selection questions one can study to select eigenvectors at different frequencies. So we derive this phase aligned. We want to compare it with conventional method that are being used in the literature. The first, obviously, is principal component analysis. Another method being used a lot in the literature are independent component analysis. Similar to PCA, it also does not take into account the temporal dependence. We considered two methods in the literature. One is singular spectral analysis. Another is PCA. Both of them work with the both of them work with some temporal dependence with optimization target function to minimize cross spectrum. So to return to our tool example, this is what we have, the two rotating source of dynamic, and the PCA failed to discover the underlying. And because this example was motivated by our proposed framework, we can see that the phase-aligned spectral filtering framework perfectly recovered the two spatial dynamic systems that we used to generate the signal, separate, denoised the data, separate the signals from the residuals. Also, the other three methods, we can see that the independent component analysis produces similar trends as PCA because it didn't take into account the temporal dependence of the data. So it generates some independent component, but it didn't capture the smooth movement of the system, and also it failed to extract all the temporal dependence in the data. The two time series method, the singular spectrum analysis and the PCA for time series, one thing that we noticed that it also denoised the data rather nicely, so they produce clearer spatial temporal signals because it was working with try to reduce dimension in the spectral domain, but it does not do the decomposition properly, and then and it doesn't separate the system into two interpretable component. We also create another example that is commonly of interest in different scientific domain, that you may have signals at different spatial location, and the signal propagate systematically through the space. So here we have signals at the four corners of a square, and each of this is follow a moving average model, and they disseminate through the space at different frequencies. And then once you mix them together, you have a noisy coupled system. You see some trends, but it's very hard to make sense of the source of the dynamic and how the spatial temporal dynamic works. And you can see that the PASF, our proposed method, were able to uncover the underlying system and separate the signal from noises, while the other method will display some interesting patterns, but didn't offer a highly interpretable series for subsequent analysis. Back to our real data. So this is the one of the first example from sea level pressure, and we focus on the one particular part of the Pacific Ocean that to look closer. So we don't know what the ground truth is, and this is the observed data that shows that some high value of the pressure dominate the system, dominant area for a while, and then move away, and where some low pressure move forward. And we decomposed. First of all, the PCA does not have this. PCA and ICA do not recover the spatial temporal, and then the other two methods for time series also didn't separate the signals. So we focus on the PSSF results. One can see that it decomposed the dynamic into two systems. One is moving from the left to the right. The other is from the upward, one can see. So this, we are not claiming that this is definitely the underlying system. Just similar to the principal component analysis, that we do not believe that the system was generated by independent series, but we are decomposing the dynamic into such principal component series for better interpretability. And the one thing we discovered is that in this area, that the system alternating between two systems, one system in winter, one system in summer, and in winter, that you have a system dominating in this area, and then with high area here, high pressure here and low pressure here, creating some dynamic this way. And where in the summer you see another system in the lower right corner that is moving in a different dimension. So we believe that we may be capturing some interesting, scientific meaningful features in this area. For the brain activity example, that we also apply the same method. And here the results show that we offer this is the x-axis are different frequencies, and the y-axis are the eigenvalues of the eigenvalues, and then we'll also evaluate which eigenvalues is being clustered into which component due to spatial similarities, as a way of checking whether our assumption that we shouldn't assemble the components by the value of their by the numerical values, rather by spatial resemblance. So here you can see that the first principle, which is a dark blue, are concentrated in the lower frequency, but also have elements in the higher frequency, but not necessarily the highest eigenvalue. For the third principle, that's where you can see that the first principle have some of them are the first eigenvalues in this frequency, but are the second eigenvalues in other frequencies. So this shows that if we use spatial similarities to assemble, that we will not creating the same principal component series as if we use numerical orders of the eigenvalues. So also we can see that here is the two voxels that have similar similar loadings in the principal component series with different lag values, and here we plot out the signal values of the two voxels. As you can see that they're coupled rather nicely with a delay. And then so another way we see that is this is the signal frame, and the component one captured a very slow movement, and then this is the figures we made is in real time. So we do not believe that this is the brain activity. We believe this may have something to do in the data processing. Some of the data processing requires some spatial correction, which may inadvertently create some slow biases that can be corrected. And then the second and the third principles are show moving quickly, faster, and then show some notable spatial structure. The residual of the data after removing the first three components demonstrate another use of this method to separate slow moving systematic movement from more interesting and more localized movement in applications such as neuroscience. You can see that in the previous image, the data is dominated by the high energy slow movement. And in the residual, you see some more interesting locally structured spiking of neurons that still have low spatial dependence. So this could offer another way of using the filtering method to separate slow dynamic from fast dynamic. So to summarize that in this work, we are trying to create a spectral filtering method to efficiently reduce dimension for high dimensional time series. And it is achieved using phase alignments and in the spectral domain using spatial information, which lead to spatial dynamic components. So I want to use the next 2 minutes to tell you a little bit about LEAP. So LEAP is a new center, as I said, that is trying to address the computing for the using leverage AI to advance climate modeling. So the climate modeling that is the weather and climate modeling are connected, but with different temporal resolution, where weather is a shorter time span and more local and smaller, higher spatial resolution, where climate modeling is a longer time span and lower spatial resolution. But both have in common is that it based on model that directly integrate the equation of motion and other processes, and they want to predict future evolution of the atmosphere. And this week is actually a very good time to have this conversation, given we just observe some immediate impact of climate change in some natural disasters in the news that have a better predictive skills for both weather and climate forecasting would become more and more important. So in the learning question in the weather climate modeling also need to take into account thermodynamics, reactive effects, and other time evolving boundary conditions. And recently that the algorithm advances and numerical techniques offered by AI and exponential expansion of computing power have opened more opportunities for climate modeling. And conventionally, that the improvement of modeling advance by adding more variable processes, increasing the spatial resolution, and then creating more interaction between different components, such as the biosphere, and then the cloud and the ocean. And machine learning are offering different paths other than adding details. So one thing to bear in mind is that for weather climate modeling, data come in different forms, and data can often be outputs of models on subgrid scale physics. That because over the hundreds of years of research that we have knowledge and understanding of physics at smaller scales, and because climate system is a physical system, and we have a good understanding of how the system works at a smaller scale. When we need to simulate the global climate, we are using data that on the small scale try to extrapolate to the larger scale. And on the other hand, for observations from satellite images, from local floats, from readings, and from local weather stations, the data are neither representative or comprehensive. So these are two very unique features of climate modeling. Another feature is that in order to make advances, it is important to have a system that's both physical driven and data driven. And the structure of the underlying system is of interest to scientists in both ways. One is that it offers potential utility to machine learning to reduce parametric uncertainty because observations are sparse and unbiased. And also that if machine learning can go structure free and attain good predictive accuracy, maybe it can return to discover new structures that was not captured by the current knowledge. And then one possible way to go about this is to use known equations to develop such systems so that we can develop a method to discover new equations. And then machine learning, given its way of navigating complex structures, can offer opportunity to join learn a couple systems. So in LEAP, we are trying to evaluate some neural network-based black box approaches for certain computational approaches, but at the same time, seek opportunity to develop interpretable AI tools to help us discover sciences. We also want to develop learning algorithms that can leverage physical knowledge and respect physical constraints. And then reduced auto models is of great interest. First, it will allow us to develop from the highly computational intensive climate modeling to derive understanding, and also not just learn patterns, but also derive simpler physics models to advanced sciences, and also to identify opportunities using machine learning that can allow us to simplify the computation of the climate system to accelerate the projection of climate system models that can allow us to understand the impact and climate change and to evaluate adaptation strategies in a faster fashion. So thank you. That's all I have to prepared.
Thank you, Tian, for the wonderful talk. Next, let's move to the Q&A sessions. If any of you have questions, feel free to put in Q&A session of the WebEx app. Then I will relate to Professor Zheng. So actually, Tian, I have a question. I wonder, have you tried to use your method in those medical imaging? It's kind of like your second example, the signal collected from mice, because in medical imaging, there's a functional MRI data. So each MRI is like one image, but functional, it's over the time. It sounds like your method can be applied to those kind of data as well, right?
So we believe we can. We have not, but we believe we can find utility of the method in those applications as well. We have not done that, but with the right collaborator, we are more than happy to explore that.
Right. How scalable is your method? Because those medical imaging data, usually it's like really big. Each MRI, yeah.
So the original algorithm was developed using MATLAB. Well, the first iteration was using R, so it was a little slower because R does not have the special toolkits for fast Fourier transform and then time series analysis. And in our collaboration with Professor Hillman's lab, we adopted the algorithm in MATLAB that runs rather quickly by leveraging the special functions in MATLAB for time series. We also are thinking about developing the code into using tensor-based libraries in Python. We believe that can also further accelerate. I think GPU can also offer a great time-saving benefits because a lot of computation are very highly parallelable And then the matrix manipulation. There are a lot of matrix manipulation in the algorithm that can benefit from different libraries.
That
And we
sounds great.
also,
Yeah.
we also in part of the dissertation of my students, we in the last part we reasoned if we impose sparse requirements that the decomposition actually can be translated into another class of functional time series model that may also may avoid the spectral analysis altogether. So we are also hoping to explore that further.
So that sounds great. Yeah. Or instead of MATLAB, another language I used a lot, it's Julia. It's open source and it's very good for high performance computing. Yeah. Like for imaging and so on. We do have a few questions in the chat. A question from Steve Harp is are there any publication references for this talk?
So we have this on archive. We didn't. So the publication was delayed because the student graduated and the postdoc's departure. But we decided to post it on archive. So the method is describing archive with Leap, because we now have a very good collaborator in climate modeling. So now we are hoping to further develop this method to find its application in climate modeling and try to create computational algorithms for climate system models.
I see. Sounds great. I suppose the archive paper, the title is just essentially we can just search your talk title, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. There's another question from Diana Bull. So your talk is fantastic, and her question is about the residuals, residuals in the neuroimaging example. Her question is, can you include more components?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I forgot to mention the reason. So for example, if you in the literature, like Hua mentioned in the medical imaging of fMRI, in the resting state brain activities, there is a literature of connectum, right? Like people want to analyze how the brain is connected, right? So the state-of-art analysis in that literature is to compute correlation between different voxels and applying different kind of like shrinkage, regularity, non-negative least square, right? A lot of them are trying to identify how each of the area are connect with each other. So if you think about the example I projected, that if there is a slow dominating, we know that in the time series analysis, the slow movement have higher energy, right? So if you do PCA, that your correlation may be dominated by the slow movement, but some local spiking may be high frequency and lower energy that can be masked by the lower movement. And if you calculate correlation on the original data, you may get the connector mostly driven by slower movement rather than fast movements. So it will be interesting to filter out those slow movement. And currently what being done is some people will just subject a lower filter, just throw out everything from the lower frequency and only keep the higher frequency of the signal and calculate correlation. But that can be lousy in a way that there may be a small lower energy, lower frequency component that related to the high frequency that in a spatial way that need to be kept. But if by blankly throw out the low frequency signals, you are throwing out baby with the bath water. So we think that this spatially structured filtering offered a way of separating the signal into different beams and then determining which beams are more scientific relevant to different downstream tasks. So you can definitely include more components.
Sounds great. There's another question from Joe. Again, great presentation. And Joe wonders, is this approach linked to dynamic mode decomposition?
I'm not familiar with that method. I think if it's in the temporal domain, that it may be different. One disadvantage of this method is that it uses the spectral domain, so it's not a projection. So it needed the entire time span in order for the computation. So the reason why we decided to work on the sparse version of it and develop a model is that we want to be able to predict and do forecasting. I believe that I suspect the dynamic mode decomposition is to analyzing the concentration of the information dynamically. So that may be a more temporal tonal domain approach.
Yeah, so we are 3 minutes past 10. Let me go to the last question from Patricia. Can you please comment on the PCA approach compared to the sequential Monte Carlo approach and the ensemble common filter approach regarding spatial temporal modeling?
So the common filter. So I'm not sure what the sequential Monte Carlo approach. So I'm going to comment on because that's a computational approach, not a model. I want to comment on the common filter approach. The common filter assume a latent space. So our approach assume principal component series that is not contemporary. So different from the common filter, that the current time point of the principal component series may be filtered to all the time points. However, the sparse version, that the truncated version we're trying to create, may have a similarity. That was for a lot of scientific domain, we believe the truncated version by truncating the filter, not allow the filter to go all the way to infinity, but have the filter truncated to have a window, may make it more computational more efficient, but also more interpretable and forecast friendly. And that may actually draw some inspiration from the common filter approach.
Sounds good. I think it's time for us to wrap up the webinar. Let's thank Professor Tian again for the wonderful talk and the answers to all these questions. Also, thank you all for coming, and we do look forward to seeing you in the next webinar sponsored by ASA Statistical Computing section.